Warning: the contents of this podcast series often include sensitive subject matter and themes that might not be suitable for all viewers. Potentially triggering issues are discussed, and viewer discretion is advised.
If you or someone you care about are dealing with issues that impact their mental, emotional health, sexual health, or physical safety, please check out the resources linked in the bio or reach out to us directly. We are here to assist you toward emergency care and experts. Prioritize your well-being and sense of safety.
Hello, and welcome back to Shattered Foundations, Reconstructed Self, a podcast where we interview members of the deconstruction community to hear their stories and share them with the world. Here, we dive deeper into the process of deconstructing religion and then reconstructing yourself, who you are, what you believe, and how you are moving forward and rebuilding your personal foundation. I am your host, Tahir Dixon, joined today by my absolutely fantastic podcast partner and co-host, Garnet. How are you this evening?
I'm well, excited to be here, excited to hear your voice again. Thanks to hear.
Yeah, of course. Glad to have you, as always. And today for episode 5, Garnet and I share the honor of speaking with a fellow Deconstruction Junction member about their story, which is a little bit different than the stories we've shared thus far. And it might even be a little bit different from many other deconstruction stories as well. I don't want to give too much away, but this will be a fascinating conversation today. And so for today's episode, we will be chatting with Asheron. Asheron, how are you this evening?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Good, glad to hear it.
Before we get into our conversation with Asheron, as always, we want to thank you for taking the time to listen to our podcast. Hopefully there will be something in today's episode you can take with you. Make sure you like, share, comment, and click that notifications bell so you are always up to date on the latest episode of Shattered Foundations, Reconstructed Self. We release new episodes weekly. Now, Asheron, I am really excited to get into this with you because I've been thinking a lot about the call that we had with one another with Tahir, the three of us, and I'm really fascinated with talking about what your views and perceptions are. What are some of your earliest views and perceptions of religion?
So I'm one of those people that from the age that I was old enough to understand the claims I was being asked to believe, I saw through them. I saw what I consider to be the game mechanic that was going on, the thing that was being played, and I knew it wasn't true. I just immediately, like somebody's flicked on a switch. I'm sure somebody told me about it before I was old enough to really understand the claim I was being asked to believe, like when I was 3 and 4, but I was, 4.5 or 5, sitting in a Sunday school, and I remember when it just clicked.
I love that for you.
Do you remember what it was? What was the thought that you had, or what was being discussed, or you just have that memory of that happening?
Well, yes, I do kind of remember it was something that kind of started to spiral almost immediately when it was the very first Bible story I ever remember being told. It was the story of Abraham and Isaac and going up the cliff and Abraham convincing himself to murder his son on behalf of a voice in his head. And I mean, that kind of raised my hackles immediately because I was, 4.5 or 5 years old, and I knew that whatever that was not love.
Right.
So that immediately got my hackles up. But this all happened like within the span of 10 minutes or so.
Yeah.
That's super interesting that at that age, that's a story that was being told to you. You know what I mean? Like, you would think that they would save that one until you were a little bit older, but I guess not. Get them while they're young.
Scare them off young. Yeah. But I kind of want to unfold this moment if you have the capacity to remember, because that is such a young age and that's so impressionable. So what I really kind of want to tease out from your story is, what was it like for you as a child to hear that kind of thing and then not be, for example, subsumed by like worry or fear or anything like that? Because of all the stories to see through, it's the one where a child is being sacrificed by the parent, and you as a child having to go home with a parent, right? At the end, having arrived to that place with a parent, right? Like, there's not a lot of ways that the brain at that age can like compare it to other kinds of things. So it would be easy for you to kind of see yourself in that position. Like, I know when I heard that story, that's kind of what I thought about. Like, oh man, like what if my parents did that kind of thing? Not that you necessarily had to like cognitively process that at such a young age, but just along the line of coincidences, I find it fascinating that that's the story that you saw through, but that story has such deep psychological programming between the parent and the child. Like the fact
Mm-hmm.
that you saw through that instantaneously is just fascinating to me.
I figure I'm sure there's lots of places where they kind of will tiptoe you into the more unsavory, I would describe, stories in the Bible
Mhm.
to give
Mhm.
some people, a chance to tiptoe their way in, and then before you know it, you're up to your neck. I
Right.
guess for the Sunday school that I was in, they took kind of the opposite approach. It was the bonsai and convinced them that this is love, so that everything else after this is just waiting.
Mm.
Because of the
Wow.
nature of my childhood and growing up, I knew that's not the kind of thing that loving parents do. That was just the thing that initially got me suspicious, right off the bat.
Mhm.
I was not a
Mm.
typical 5-year-old. I spent more time actually just thinking things through as a 5-year-old.
So kind of
Mm.
analytical, would you say? You were like an analytical kid?
Yeah, kind of. I think so. Yeah.
Mm.
This was more something like this didn't logically compute kind of thing.
Well, like I said, because of the nature of how I grew up as a person with a permanent disability as the result of an illness as a kid. And my youngest
Oh.
Mhm.
memories are of family taking me to doctor's appointments.
Mm.
Mm.
And like
Mhm.
grandfather telling the ladies in the waiting room about, this is my grandson and he got really, really sick, but he got to the hospital and he got the help that he needed and he's alive and well today and we're so grateful.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
I know what it means when parents will care about their children and will do whatever they can to help their children.
Okay.
That makes
That's
sense.
awesome. And I think that's so powerful that the backdrop of comparing that story was like a loving dynamic, was a loving family dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
That was
Yeah.
literally like inoculated you before you went in. And so you really couldn't contract the virus, so to speak.
But that's interesting because as we've been talking, I'm wondering if, because you even said, like, it seems like kind of an atypical approach to start so heavy, so young, instead of like, well, this is how it was created, and then, the flood, and like, all that stuff. But
Hmm.
I don't know. It's just, I'm trying to figure out what is the psychological reason why they would feel like that's the way to go.
What they're trying to do is to start off by skewing what you think love is so that
Hmm.
Oh.
other things in their religion that they want to tell you are love don't seem as absurd. They've already convinced you that Abraham dragging his son up onto a sacrificial stone to go stab him to death for God is also an act.
Yes.
Right.
That's a
So,
great point.
and I think like there's a very common saying I've heard through the deconstruction community for many, many decades. There's no hatred so vile as Christian love.
It's
Right.
Christian love. Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
Wow.
So what happened when you had that experience? You were like, nah, that doesn't make any sense. What was your next move as a kid?
So, like I said, this all happened in basically the very first time that I ever went to Sunday school. It all happened within the span of like 10, 15 minutes of just asking a few questions. Like I said, that story just got me a bit suspicious and got me
Mm-hmm.
saying, maybe I need to just sit down and listen to what they're saying carefully here. When I was talking to the Sunday school teacher, whoever it was, I was asking them, so, Jesus was a Jew, right? And she said, yes, yes, he was. And I said, okay. And then he, as a Jew, came bringing what they were claiming to be the obvious truth of Christianity to the Jewish people. She said, yes,
Hmm.
absolutely right. And I said, okay, well, then it would stand to reason that if he's a Jewish person bringing Jewish people the obvious truth, that the Jews would be the first to accept the truth of it.
Mm.
They'd know better. If he's
Mm.
bringing the obvious truth, this was just me as a 4.5, 5-year-old, something like that,
Wow.
just parsing it together.
Hmm.
It stands to
Yeah.
reason. Your own, like your family coming to tell you something, you're more likely to believe them that is true, especially if it's obviously true.
Mm-hmm.
I said, so there must be basically no Jews left. Like they must have all converted to this obvious truth of Christianity, right? She said, no,
Hmm.
Jews. There's still many Jews. There's millions of Jews. Right. So I said, well, like, so why do they still believe Judaism? And I remember it like somebody was flipping on a light switch. He said, well, they take it on faith that it's true. And I said, so exactly like how you told me that you take it on faith that Christianity is true. And
Yeah.
deadpan, not realizing what she had done, she said, yes, absolutely like that. And like I got hit by lightning and a moment of clarity. What I knew at 5 years old was that people who are trying to navigate with a broken compass that always tells you you're facing north no matter which way you're facing are not people trying to
Hmm.
find their way. They're people trying to get lost and trying to get you lost along with them.
Yeah. 100%.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
That was me at 5 years old at a Sunday school in my rural community.
Wow.
And did you guys end up going back to that church? What was it like trying to convey this to your parents?
I mean, to the extent that I had to, all I did was tell my parents, I said, all right, you sent me there. I don't think that this stuff is true. I think it's all just make believe. I don't really want to go back. It seems silly. And my parents just said, okay.
Wow.
The thing is, my parents were not religious. And if I were to look back now, I would say they probably would have said at the time even that they were atheists, but they never actually talked to us about it, about themselves specifically either.
Mm.
They took a very much, you figure it out for yourself and get back to us when you have the truth.
Mm-hmm. And did you have siblings, or were you an only child?
I have a sister and a brother. I'm the middle child.
Oh, okay. Were you all going to church, and were they kind of on board with your decision to not want to go?
I mean, we never really went to church per se anyway. My sister did a bit of Sunday school, and I'm sure my brother did a little bit of Sunday school too, but
Mm-hmm.
it was the kind of thing where it wasn't that big a deal to them, and in our family, we just didn't pay that close of attention to it. So I was basically the only one that like ever spoke up about it, as far as I know. Like, I would be willing to put money that my brother and my sister are both atheists and have probably always been, but they didn't talk about it. They didn't spend much time like tearing it apart like I did, as far as I know.
Okay. Wow.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That is cool.
I'll chalk it up to the benefit of like, my dad's a PhD in geology, my mom's a master's in biology, so they taught us how to think from a young age, you know.
That makes perfect sense then why, they have the exact skill set to like not fall for something like that, because they are very, very much science based, which doesn't necessarily mesh that well with religion. But then that also makes sense why, two people with brains like that would make a child with a brain like yours that's like, wait, what? At 4 or 5 years old, like, wait a second, something's going on here. Whereas most kids are, none the wiser, like eating it up because you don't know any better. You're just kind of listening to what you're told. But like, you had that edge of just enough experience from your situation, but also that analytical brain to where you were kind of skirt. You know what I mean? So that totally makes sense.
I'm thinking about the experience that you said, like, what the love of a parent actually is, and that story with Abraham is just not it. I think about even my own parents, and I know that my parents loved me to the best of their ability. I know that they were doing what they thought was best, but they were also subsumed into the cult itself. So it was like, even though I knew that they told me that they loved me and I knew that they cared and I saw that they were trying and I saw and could recognize even at a young age the kinds of sacrifices that they were making to raise me and my family and my extended family, there still wasn't that trust there to go and ask those kinds of questions and make those kinds of statements. Yeah, I really do want to stress the importance of cultivating those strong, healthy family dynamics. That really is the preventative methodology, I would say, to not getting drawn into cult-like behavior, because then you can immediately recognize the red flags. But when your own family is dysfunctional, and when your own, when those, and that's not to say that your family doesn't have dysfunction, because everyone's dealing with their own kind of flavor of that. But with that baseline of mutual trust there, you were free to ask questions in a way that I just could not see for my own self at that age. And so I think I just want to like highlight that moment as an important thread here in fostering the proper skill sets in children so that they become the kind of critical thinking adults that we need, that we really need in society.
That's so true.
And I've even met teachers. I mean, I had a biology teacher that was there was one of my church members stood up and made the stand for Christ. And we had gotten to the point in biology class where they were talking about theories of the universe, and the teacher had posited the Big Bang Theory. And then right away she stood up for her faith, this classmate of mine, and was like, no, God created the earth. No, it was created in 7 days. No, it's 6,000 years. And it was just like, oh my God, girl. And she went to my church. Like, I knew her family and she knew my family. And so it was like super awkward. It was extra weird. And I remember even the teacher being like, well, because the girl had asked, like, aren't you a Christian? Like, don't you believe in da da da? And she was like, the teacher was like, yeah, I am a Christian actually, and biology and science just reaffirms my faith. And so I
Mm.
do see those instances where people who are teachers, I not professors, like teachers in high school, where they can kind of do that balancing act of, having a career in education and then also having faith. But
Mhm.
I also will say I feel like there is a correlation between how involved they are in church life versus how steep they are in school, like in the schooling piece. And I feel like people that get into teaching in like university settings need to investigate more critically, like page by page, line by line, word by word, concept by concept. Like it's like getting down to the nitty gritties of things and learning how to look at the nitty gritty of thing because that's what you're teaching people at an adult age.
Mhm.
But I find that very interesting. I find that very interesting that you had that opportunity to be able to ask those kinds of questions and make those kind of assertions without being accused of something,
Yeah.
accused of being a demon or whatever it was that people will quiet children with. Yeah.
No, that's a good point too, even just from the standpoint of like, depending on familial dynamics, you may not necessarily feel comfortable and or confident enough and or have the space to be able to say, I don't like this, I don't agree with this, I don't want to do this. You may be raised in an environment where you don't say how you feel, what you think, or you know better, or this could even be that moment where you learn, oh, okay, whether it's consciously or
Yeah.
subconsciously, that moment of, oh, what I want doesn't matter, or what I think doesn't
Mhm.
matter, or this is more important than
Yeah.
what I think or feel. And so I think
Yeah.
that, yeah, the familial dynamics and the strength, of family from that standpoint, I could also see that, yeah, speaking
Mhm.
to the ability that Ashron had, even to just be like, yeah, I don't like this. Don't make me do this. And they're like,
This
yeah,
is
no,
weird.
cool. Uh huh. Yeah.
There's a couple of things about that really, and part of it I think is that I'm kind of careful about how I go about talking about this subject because my parents were both scientists, that's true, but there are also plenty of decent scientists who are also religious.
Yeah.
And to me, that just speaks to, and it's always kind of spoken to, humans' ability to compartmentalize bullshitting themselves, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
when someone like Kurt Wise he's quite a well-known geologist and also quite a well-known creationist, or at least was very, very well-known geologist, and he is famous for saying something along the lines of, I know that the earth is older than what people say it is in the Bible, and I know that this story from the Bible is not factually accurate, but when it's all said and done, I'm going to throw away the science textbook no matter how right I know it is because I need to believe in this story.
Wow.
And Richard Dawkins is famous for saying, like, if it can do something like that to someone who is as well educated as Kurt Wise, and he was well educated,
Mm-hmm.
and like what it can do to people who aren't well educated the same way that Kurt Wise is. So,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah. I agree.
growing up with a scientist or scientifically minded parents is no guarantee that you're going to have even an advantage.
100%.
Yes.
I can't imagine James Torr's children, if he has them, are, terribly advantaged by him and his scientific education. He's a Creation Institute or whatever, the Discovery Institute.
Wow.
Apologies.
Yeah.
That's
Well, and that's why I
interesting.
brought up the example of my biology professor in school because I also like I want to give props where it's due because I like your story here because it is a deconstruction story. It just started at 5 years old with the story of Abraham and ding, it was over. But the reason why I brought up my biology teacher because I want to be very clear to, all of us here and our listeners as well. It really is not a matter of like personal intelligence or even personal capability. It's really not a matter of, oh, I'm too smart to get drawn into a cult or I know what I'm doing or I know how to, it's really not a matter of that. People with all kinds of abilities can get sucked down this rabbit hole. It really is nefarious in how it works because it's, for me, how I see it, it's something that really leans onto more survival mind programming. And that is beyond IQ level. That's beyond rationale. That's beyond your cognitive thinking processes, although, they're all intricately tied together because it's your brain and your spinal cord. But it really does tap into like the survival mechanisms of a person and really leans on those kind of fear based programs to operate. And so I watch this in live streams where I've seen some of the dull and funny, like, oh my God, this person cannot be a real person. But then I've also listened to very intelligent people bend themselves into pretzels because it's not from the front of the brain, seeping back in. It really is, for me, how I understand it, it really is more geared toward the spinal column, those survival mechanism. Death is imminent. You have the kind of these binary kinds of choices. You have this good, bad, right, wrong. It's very much in the binary. You're either going to live or you're not going to live. You're in God's good favor or you're not in God's good favor. It's very binary, kind of life-threatening programming. And from that foundation builds all kinds of labyrinths and layers of reasoning, quote unquote, rationale, quote unquote. So I really wanted to hone in that point that it really is not a matter of intelligence or capability, because we see in our live streams very capable and very intelligent people just justifying the most, for lack of better terms, god awful things,
Mhm.
the most god awful things. So yeah, that's why I wanted to bring up my biology teacher from high school.
There's another thing to consider, especially as we're all engaged in trying to build secular communities, is that religions have had thousands and thousands of years privilege to fine tune the, for lack of a better word, science of manipulating people into believing
Mhm.
certain types of
Yes,
claims, or manipulating them
absolutely.
into the actual game mechanic of what a god is. So they have a lot of practice, just like with every system humans have ever invented. We didn't get it right the first time, but the longer it's been around, the more we've been able to fine tune it and make it
Hmm.
institutionalized.
Wow. Yeah, it definitely is powerful. And like you said, it's had a long, long time to get it to this point.
And even if we didn't, I mean, to quote one of my favorite TV shows, humans are masters of self deception.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, you hear it every day in the lives, the amount of cognitive dissonance that people have when you really confront them with, this is what the Bible says, this is what your religion says, what do you say? And how often they either, I think it's wrong, but I'm going to justify it, or it would be wrong if not for the fact that God says it's okay. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
So I take kind of a different view than a lot of atheists on these kinds of issues and this kind of a subject.
Mm-hmm.
I think basically all of religion generally is one big smokescreen for one specific game mechanic of life. If you like, I'll let you in on the secret. For the low price of $99.99, along with that story that I was telling you about when I was 5 in Sunday school, at that time, I'm pretty sure I found out exactly what God is, or what all gods are. And what they are is, nuh-uh, I'm right because shut up.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what
Literally.
gods are, as far as I can tell, and as far as anybody's ever been able to show me. It's not an actual thing. It's not an actual agent or an entity that thinks things or does things or says things or brings
Interesting.
profits or anything of that. It is the socially acceptable veto that believers give each other to deny reality in favor of a preferred delusion or lie. That's what a god is, as far as I.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So when
That's
a believer
fascinating.
says, oh, my God doesn't agree with
Yeah.
slavery, even though I call myself a Christian, and in the Bible it's explicitly
It
pro-slavery.
literally gives
Mm-hmm.
instructions step by step.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah,
something I want to explore with you then, because I'm interested in this conclusion that you've come to now, but I also really want to ask you questions about, okay, let me kind of connect these dots here. Because we're describing, behaviors in the live stream and kind of the typical things, the typical patterning that we see in Christians. They all kind of make the same fallacies. They make the same kind of wrong, kind of logical arguments. We can kind of see the similar patterns from Christian to Christian. There isn't too much variation from what I've noticed from denomination to denomination, although I will say I do see differences between Catholic, Orthodox Christian, and then like everyone else. So I haven't quite pinned down what that is, but there isn't that much distinction in the kinds of logical fallacy traps that they all tend to fall in. So I'm interested to know, especially you being so analytical at such a young age, did you start noticing patterns and behaviors of the kids around you? Because it doesn't just stay contained within their religion. It's not like they're only making straw man arguments in their religion. Like, no, it becomes diffused in just how they are as people. And so, being on that outside looking in, do you start to notice any patterns amongst kids your own age that are kind of growing up being indoctrinated?
I did. I noticed one pattern very specifically, which is kind of what led me to my conclusion of what God actually is. And it started with a question that I'll ask you, and I'm curious to hear your answers. Have you ever noticed how God always agrees with whoever telling you what God thinks 100% of the time?
Mm.
So you're saying everybody's idea of God is different, but it's always 100% right in their mind? Is that what you're saying?
Whoever is telling you what God thinks, that God just happens to coincidentally agree with everything that person is telling you God thinks.
Right.
Mhm.
Which is,
Okay.
if you're putting the dots together, what you're really being told is what that person thinks, and they just want to be right and shut up about it because God told me I'm right, because no, I'm right, shut up.
Because, I'm right, shut up.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's kind of where I came to this conclusion. Nobody ever comes to you telling you what God thinks, and it's the opposite of what that person actually values themselves. The socially acceptable veto that religious people go around winking at each other, saying, "No, that means you get away with the conversation. We don't get to criticize you
Mhm.
because God's revealed it to you." And I can't ever actually prove this, but I really feel like I can't give people too little credit to know that on some level believers don't understand the actual game, the social contract that's going on there that I see through.
Yes. Yep.
I think on some level, all believers are kind of aware of the thing that they're doing.
Yeah.
Now, like I said,
Mhm.
I don't know that I could ever prove that, but it seems to fit because even when I was a 5 year old, I had been to like nursery school or kindergarten or whatever, and like everybody, I think that age knows somebody who is in the playground that no matter what you said, no matter how wrong they are, all they ever said to you was, "Nuh-uh, nuh-uh, nuh-uh."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, just replace that with what God told me, and it's the exact same thing.
That's a good point.
So, yeah, I hear what you're saying about this. And I would say, like, the doctrine doesn't program their adherents to have the kind of self reflection and integrity that it takes to be honest about that kind of thing. There really are no metrics for internal self reflection. The only thing you're encouraged to do is to weigh what you think you're hearing against what's in the Bible, against what's in the text. Or depending on what vein of Christianity you're in, against what are the early, quote unquote, the early church fathers are saying.
Mm-hmm.
So their only metrics for self-evaluation are comparing either the thought or the feeling or the concept idea that they're comparing what is being held internally to some externalized document or to some kind of externalized authority. And so within the doctrine itself, there just are not hardly any metrics for self-reflection. The only thing to self-reflect on is the fact that you are incapable, you're the lowest of the low, you're unworthy, you're a sinner, you're dirty, all this sort of thing, and then you need to be cleansed. So their only comparison is always some sort of externalized thing. But the problem is that while humans are evolving and changing, what's written on those papers aren't.
Mm-hmm.
You're not gonna open it up and magically find, "Oh, you should be using these glasses or use monocles instead of I mean, you're not gonna find it's not gonna update itself.
Mm-hmm.
It's a static snapshot of human history,
Yeah.
or a static snapshot of stories of human history. So you can't look at the self. You also can't go against what's written in these externalized documents. And so that doesn't build the integrity to be honest enough to be forthcoming about this kind of thing. And also, the reality is that the doctrine itself is so incoherent within itself, especially the Christian Bible between the Old and the New Testament, that you can even find those externalized justifications and stand on opposite sides of the same issue. And so this is where we'll get many Christians that will accuse us of the cherry picking, but they're actually honestly the only ones that are constantly cherry picking, because if
Mm-hmm.
they want to stand 10 toes down on slavery, they can. And if they want to stand 10 toes down on Jesus did away with the law, they can sort of pull up this narrative that says, well, Jesus came to fulfill the law, and that means it's over. To do away with it. Da, da, and they'll just kind of make up their own kind of thing.
Mhm.
But you'll see how on each side of that issue, they can try to find an interpretation from the text that makes sense for where they want to land on a specific issue. And
Mhm.
that to me is like how you're using the same book, the same text to justify the complete diametrically opposed positions on the same issue.
Mhm.
That to me is a huge sign that the doctrine in and of itself is incoherent, and it cultivates a following that is inherently incoherent, and then they're just okay with it. And if they are seeing it, much more willing to let it go and say, oh, it's his ways are not our ways, he's above us, we can't understand it, and then just roll right back into the comfort of, I don't know, I don't have all the answers, all we just have these clues from the Bible, and then you're right back to square one.
Well, so for me, I kind of think that I approach it from the opposite end, kind of, because I don't think it actually has anything to do with doctrine. If anything, I think this actually reinforces my point about what I think God is, because I don't think the Bible actually says anything anymore. Because the Bible says whatever whoever needs it, whoever's reading it needs it to say for any given time, for any given situation.
Mm-hmm.
So what it is actually a mirror for you to tell us what you want it to mean rather than what it does actually say. And I think they do that because that, culturally speaking, that is the core and source of their authority to say, no, I'm right because shut up. To me, I have to think that I can't be so uncharitable to think that people who go through these books, cherry pick it, don't recognize the fact that, every time I read this book, the God tells me things that I already agree with.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and actually, that's a good point, because what I was going to say marries a little bit of what both of you guys are saying. But because when I hold up what you said against my own experience, I see it as I was, you look at the Bible and the teachings as like a mirror, right? So, some of the core tenets, like you shouldn't lie, you shouldn't, murder, da 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 da, like those kinds of things, I think, are morals that I don't know if they were always there, but clearly they were there really early on that still hold true to this day. So maybe you could say it's like a reflection of who I am morally speaking. Like, I don't think you should lie. I don't think you should steal. I don't think you should, da 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 da. But then the flip side of that is when it came to my version of, and maybe what a lot of people do in that whole cognitive dissonance thing, is it's like, okay, now what I'm seeing in this book is not really marrying with what I actually think and feel or what I'm experiencing in my own life. And now I have this cognitive dissonance. So now I'm going to start making my own version of God so that I can maintain some level of comfort in this thing that I know, but also get rid of that cognitive dissonance. And that's when you get well, my God thinks it's okay that I'm gay, and then someone else's God says something different, and then you're in I'm right because God said so, but you're both just going back and forth, and you're never going to agree from that standpoint, And so I think it's like what a lot of people do, that whole, okay, well, now I have to create my own version of God that's not in the Bible, and that whether or not you're subconsciously saying, okay, I'm going to do this. Like, it is a little bit of that intentional, like, what is it you were saying? What's the term you were saying?
No, I'm right, shut up.
Yeah. It's like, no, this is my God and I'm right. So I don't want to hear anything else about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So the thing about that I've noticed when it comes to people trying, like, basically they don't like what the book actually says, and then so they'll try to reinterpret it to something that's more akin to their natural sensibilities or the things that they've learned over the years.
Yeah, because you were saying like they pull from it, what they need to justify their own beliefs. But in some cases, it's a matter of denying what's in the book so that you can justify your beliefs, is I guess kind of what I was saying.
Sure, yeah, that makes sense. So, like, if you grew up most of your life kind of sort of maybe being aware that you had a no, I'm right button for any situation you wanted to, and you started seriously thinking about the root of that authority and that self-certainty that you had maybe not as solid as you thought it would you be wanting to give up your no, I'm right button where everybody else around you still has it?
Yeah. No, that's true too.
I wouldn't want to, like, if I was right that, I wouldn't want to give it up my God mode on video games, you know, if that was how I was
Right.
raised. So I would probably bend myself into pretzels trying to maintain my I'm right button. It all comes down to what's really important to you. Is it the truth of it, or is it how does it make you feel?
Yeah.
I'll say this, whatever else you might think about the Westboro Baptist Church, they've got the Bible on their side.
Yeah. And that makes them feel powerful.
Like anybody who believes it would feel powerful because they know God's on their side, because I'm right, shut up.
Every once in a while, I think of their songs that they rewrite. And today, it's so funny you brought them up because you know they rewrite songs, right? Are you guys aware of this?
No, I didn't know that.
So they release albums, they rewrite songs, and they find the most demonically, according to them, possessed, according to them, secular, Hollywood agendized person, and they will rewrite their songs. They did an Ozzy Osbourne. It was like, going straight to hell on a crazy train. And they rewrite everything to talk about like what they have divined from their scriptures. And the one that was stuck in my head all day today was the Lady Gaga. How does it go? It was Lady Gaga's Poker Face.
Monster lady, gay, gay, show your teeth, this is on me. God hates you. Fake love substitution is your game, you're just a fraud. But any half-wit sees your hateful fans and for your God. Oh, 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 you pissed off God, you'll see what he's got.
What is that?
That's crazy.
God hates you. So when you said the Westboro Baptist Church, it's like Lady Gaga in my head.
So they kids bop is what you're saying.
Yeah, like they will rewrite those songs and then drop them, and then that's part of their like recruitment tool. I don't know.
I'll take Weird Al if it comes to parody. That's
right.
Yeah.
I'm with you. With you.
But I have also seen and listened to people really kind of grapple with things that don't make sense to them, and it's weird how flexible their perception of the other is. Like it can hinge from like, oh yeah, God hates you, and then like crying and head over heels, during altar call, rolling around, wanting to defeat the devil that's got a hold on all of the people, that God just has a huge heart for all these people, but at the same time, God is also sending them to hell. So it creates like this kind of double-mindedness.
Yeah.
The particulars of it are minutia because, like I said, as far as I'm concerned, God is I'm right because shut up. The particulars are just a mirror into the person who's telling you what God thinks. And the only thing that, for me, that I'm particularly concerned is how did you actually come to the conclusion that God is real and that he agrees with you? Because it seems to be the case that everybody's just making it up and they just want their I'm right button.
Yeah. And then kind of back to the point of why people end up being okay with that, not like analyzing things further, not looking into them further, and just kind of accepting things at face value. You also have some of those other things at play, like somebody who has issues with addiction. There may be that I was able to borrow strength from this idea of a deity to get myself through this, and now I'm on the other side. And if I give up that, then what do I have? Because for a lot of people, it's hard to look inward and find that strength in yourself, to get through things. So you have those people who need to, like you've said it before, Garnet, offload, some of the things that it takes to get through really hard things and to accomplish really hard things onto, this deity. Or you have the people who use it to cope with loss, that's one of the things that's hardest for me in the whole idea of telling people what I've learned about as far as atheism and, like why I have the beliefs that I have is I know that for some people, the only thing that is getting them through the loss of somebody they love is the idea of being able to see them again. And so it's like, do I want to tell this person, well, here's all this information that shows why you probably won't? Not necessarily, because what does that mean for them? So then you have the people who need to hold on to this to cope with this loss that they've experienced, or, you can just go down a list of reasons that people have to invest in this thing that is so flimsy and, like it's different for everyone and it's incoherent, Garnet, like you said, but for some people, they have to hold on to it because of what the alternative means and what that can do for their life,
I think that's a really devious and honestly filthy trick that religions play on people.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I go through hard times in my life. Like I said, my earliest memories of life are being taken to doctor's appointments and hearing my grandfather tell like ladies in rooms about how lucky I was to be alive at an age of 5. So I think it's quite devious to try and convince somebody that without a useful lie, they couldn't do it. Like, when I'm going through hard times, sometimes I ask myself, what would Picard do?
Mm-hmm.
Captain Picard as a character is fairly morally upstanding, a decent role model, and something that you can learn something from. But Captain Picard didn't actually do any work to help me through any of that.
Mm-hmm.
It was me thinking about a fictional character in a fictional setting and about, situations that were written about that allow me then to self-examine about things in reality, about my own thoughts, my own feelings. I think that's what religions are basically doing. And they're just convincing you that you're not actually the one doing the work in using that fictional tool to examine your own thoughts and feelings. The people do that using a religion. To me, that also just sidesteps the entire issue again, because the argument for a useful lie is still a lie.
That's why people are so willing to grab onto it and to hold onto it despite, X, Y, and Z, because it's easier than the alternative, what that alternative means, so you mean to tell me that I have to keep myself sober because God's not doing it for me? Or you mean to tell me that this person that I love, I'm never going to see again? Or, once I'm gone, I'll never see the people I love. You know what I mean? Like, they're never going to see me again. Or, like I said, you can go down the list of all of these things that people would rather not confront and deal with, that it's easier to them to just cope by holding on to this religion. And that's one of the reasons why it is so effective, even when you are kind of confronted with this like cognitive dissonance, all of these reasons. There's things that a lot of people have to overcome before they can get to the point of letting it go. And that's assuming they even can get to that point, because there may be that block that, like, if I give this up, everything crumbles. Everybody's different. Everybody handles things differently. Like, people have different standards for how they want to be treated. And like, I think of situations where I've had friends who may be in a relationship that is just so objectively wrong, like they're being mistreated, like, all of the things. And in my mind, I'm like, I would never be with somebody who's treating me like that. I don't understand why they're in this relationship. But then the flip side of that is, in their mind, they have their own reasons as to why they're in it and why they can't leave, So like, people handle things differently. And I think that's one of the big problems, is it really capitalizes on those fears and weaknesses and faults in personality, like, not wanting to take charge of specific things. It's just easier to give it up to somebody else, like, at all of these costs, but at least this part of my life is easier,
Yeah, I think that's kind of the trick that they play on you. We can't lose sight of the fact that religions have had thousands and thousands and thousands of years to perfect the art of convincing people of things to keep them in the con.
Yeah.
And part of that is 100% is emotional manipulation. And part of doing that is convincing somebody that they need this thing or they couldn't do it without it. I don't think it's useful or helpful to convince somebody that, you're going to see your dead loved one when you die. I think what that does is that teaches you to not value the time that you have with that person, that we actually know you do get with that person, or the memory that you do have of that person once they're gone.
Also, too, one of the things that Garnet speaks to a lot as well is what we're doing in this life. Like, that needs to matter more. But through religion, people get so caught up in like the afterlife, and that matters more. So, like, the way that we help people, all of those things get pushed to the side.
Yeah, I would generally agree.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you spent the first 18 years of your life being convinced you were going to get $1 billion when you graduated high school, are you ever going to understand the value of $1 before then?
Yeah.
It sure teaches you to value what you actually have as opposed to what you hope you may sort of one day have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree. I do think that is why I am an advocate for, letting go of religion and those kinds of things, because I know that people would be better served by believing in their own strength and their own faculties and, not waiting aimlessly for something to come and better their situation and knowing, nobody's going to save me. I have to save myself. I have to go out and I have to get things done, or like even the things that you've accomplished, looking back and being like, wow, I did that. I got myself through that, I think that all of those things would be so beneficial to people. And it's just, yeah, some people though, that's where they have trouble.
What we need to start out doing is valuing truth above all else. Because if you value the truth above all else, what you'll then start doing is rejecting really bad and obviously bad paths to supposed truth, like, say, just take it on faith.
Mm-hmm.
George Carlin was right about it. It's the fertile soil of bullshit upon which all other bullshit can grow.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I bring it back to my compass analogy. If you meet somebody who has a compass in their hand that tells them no matter which way they're pointing that they're actually going north, that person is not trying to navigate. They're trying to get lost and trying to get you lost along with them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's for people who don't value the truth.
Yeah.
Because the truth is you need to be able to navigate.
100%. That's one of my things lately is I've just been feeling it just feels very daunting. And it feels like it's a big fight that, we're kind of undertaking here.
Yeah, I completely understand that. And I struggle with these kinds of feelings as well myself.
Mm-hmm.
So I understand feeling dwarfed by the scale of the enemy. But the thing to remember, like I said, it comes down to two things. One of which I've mentioned a couple times already. One is that religions have had thousands and thousands and thousands of years of preferential privileged status in our society. They've had thousands of years to perfect a power base all over the world in a variety of different brands.
Mm-hmm.
And secular societies, secular groups, I mean, even today, depending on where you are, any atheist like myself who's never been very good at keeping their mouth shut knows that there are places that you go, if you don't keep your mouth shut, you'll be killed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's still today in 2025.
Mm-hmm.
20 years ago it was even more places, in even more harsh ways. 100 years ago you would have been like, no, not a chance. If you were publicly an atheist, there's a high probability, unless you were really, really wealthy, you'd be killed or jailed.
Mm-hmm.
So consider we do have an uphill battle because we haven't been privileged for thousands and thousands of years, and we're the ones who are being actively persecuted by all religious people who the only thing they can get on board with is, as a team together, is, well, those atheists are worse than we are.
Yeah.
That's one part of it. Like, to remember, yes, we are fighting an uphill battle, but that's because we're thousands of years having their head start. The other thing to remember is that the internet has only been around since about 1991 publicly. And in that time, it has become way, way easier for secular humanists and atheists to network, to build communities in safety where we don't have to worry so much about being killed by, an uppity religious person who doesn't like that we're challenging their "Nuh-uh, I'm right" button.
Mm-hmm.
And that's only been like 35 years, 36 years, something like that. And we've already come this far in 36 years versus thousands and thousands and thousands of years of privileged position. That is still religions are on the decline for a reason, and a lot of that is to do with, because of the internet now, it's a lot harder to both kill atheists and also to hide when atheists point out obvious flaws in bad religious arguments. You can't hide from it anymore. Like, we can't underestimate the watershed moment the internet creation and being made public was, and it'll never be the same until the end of human society.
Yeah.
I think that's a really profound point. I really do think that's a profound point. And something that you brought up here kind of was a light bulb moment for me about that there are people leaving religions, especially like the Abrahamic traditions, especially. And so now what I think about are the incoming generation that are either going to grow up with parents who are deconstructing, with parents that never went to church or never took it seriously, people that may be exposed to it but never kind of internalized it, just kind of like said the things, hummed the songs, and then as soon as they became an adult, just kind of took off and did their own thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's all kinds of flavors. There's all kinds of flavors of that saturation. Those of us that really internalize, and then those of us that just had to survive and upbringing and left. But something now that I think about and why I wanted to unfold your story is because I really do see this time being unprecedented in human history because of what you're talking about with the technology piece, because of what you're talking about the connectivity across time space. You're able to access people that have said things not live, right? Because it's recorded, it's imprinted onto the internet. And so, you don't have to walk 5,000 miles and then walk 500 more to listen to the person speak and be alive on the planet at the same time that they are in the same region, get to the same point in place and time and space to listen to them convey some kind of transmission that's just like, oh my gosh, yeah, I also don't think this is real. We have so much more available, whether you are around at the time of that transmission or not. And so now, what I think about, even just what we're doing with the podcast, what we're doing in our deconstruction community Discord, what we're doing with our live streams, all of those ways that we are imprinting onto the internet, building community through these kind of co-creative endeavors, and what we're leaving as an imprint for the next generation, like different kinds of tools to sort of see through this kind of smoke and mirrors game that religious doctrine has historically been on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
And what I like to think about is like, what is it going to be like for entire generations to grow up completely, I would want to say, like untainted by this, almost kind of in the opposite where you kind of think at technology. Like for me, I grew up with those CDs, listening, having a portable CD player. And then I remember my mom making comments like, "Oh, we had tapes and like the 8 tracks." And then my grandparents' generation had like the records. And so the way that technology updates, and I think about, man, what is it like to grow up with an iPhone? I had to learn the iPhone as an adult, which is
True.
different, right? I had
Mhm.
to learn an iPhone as an adult, and I'm living in the same timeline with individuals on this planet that are navigating an upgraded version of that product
Yeah.
as a toddler, as a
Yeah.
kid.
So true.
And think about that. So when I think about in terms of like exposure, like, man, they have things that I didn't have, but I'm also thinking too, like retroactively, they're not going to have this thing that I had. So what is it like to be you at that age and not be thinking about, hell and all of eternity and being left behind and all of it, whatever it is that your church kind of grappled onto and spewed onto the next generation. Like, I like to think about that kind of stuff. Like, what can those dynamics be like between young people, especially? What can those like healthy dynamics look like? Those healthy boundaries look like when it's not being warped or perverted or impeded or impressed upon by a doctrine that is so much steeped in that sort of working with the biological fears of the afterlife, fears of the unknown, fears of the unseen,
Mm-hmm.
right? You've got these things about devils and demons and all these things that you can't see, the principalities of the air and whatever else they kind of, the little magical space wizard stuff, the little battles that they got going on, right? What is it like to not have that on your plate, kind of shuffle that to the side, or maybe put it to the parameters like, oh, yeah, I know, great Uncle so and so. But for me and the rest of us, we don't take that seriously.
Yeah.
Like, how are you allowed to be? How are you allowed to think about yourself when you don't have those kinds of constraints and those burdens and those pressures impressed on you?
It's definitely something to think about.
So as you become older and you start wanting to fit in with other people, or maybe that wasn't even a thing for you, I'll let you kind of explain. But I'm really interested in that kind of like middle school, high school age. what was it like trying to navigate yourself as a person, but then have some sort of social cohesion with other people in your age group, knowing that some or all or most or a lot of these people are being indoctrinated.
So
Mhm.
the thing for me, like in junior high school to high school, the biggest hurdle for me was socializing. And even at the age of 5, I was never very good at keeping my mouth shut about things that I didn't think were true, or that I thought people had really good reasons to think was not true. So even, when I was 12 and 13, grade 7, 8, that range, I was the only person in grade school when we did religion class that I said, I'm not going to do this course because the teacher started off the course by saying, "Listen, I believes everything in the Bible is true, and that's how I'm going to teach this course, and that's how you're going to teach this course." And I was like, "Listen, I know this stuff isn't true, but I'm not
Mhm.
going to get even a proper religious education or education on religion from somebody who's starting out a course like that." And
Yeah.
luckily, my parents went to bat for me with the school board to say, like, "Listen, no, my son is not going to be indoctrinated into this thing. He knows it's not true. He's not going
Mm.
and just let them try to indoctrinate him." So
Mhm.
grade 7 and grade 8, when that was like it was a part of the required curriculum, I didn't do those courses because I mean they didn't teach me anything I didn't already know. For one,
Yeah.
Right.
I live by a few axioms when it comes to this subject, and that is one of them is can't ever trust people who believe the religion to tell me the truth about the religion.
Yeah.
I did religious studies some in university, and I have no idea what the religious views of the prof who did the intro to religion course with me,
Right.
because he started off the whole course saying, "We're going to teach this with a phenomenological approach. So we're just going to teach it like, as a matter of fact, this is what this religion includes. This is the kinds of things that it teaches. This is the kind of outlooks it has."
Mhm.
That can be very educational. I learned some specifics about certain religions that I didn't know before, about Buddhism and Hinduism and the like,
Mhm.
and some things about Judaism and Islam that I didn't know about. But
Mhm.
that's all to me is also just minutia because it's all the same game mechanic going on.
Mhm.
So to come around to it, I had a hard time socializing when I was a kid for not only that reason, but for that reason as
Mhm.
well.
What religions were you most exposed to socially, like social culturally?
Definitely Christianity. I mean, I grew up in
Okay.
Canada, so
Oh, okay.
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 or like perhaps not as evangelical and not as motivated to taking over governments here as it is in other places, but like culturally, especially speaking, like a lot of cultural Christians. And when I was growing up at that
Yeah.
time, like it was, kids were just saying things like, "Well, if you don't believe this, you're going to go to hell." That kind
Right.
of the same kind of bog standard thing that any atheist at any time has probably heard a
Mhm.
million times.
Yeah.
I just heard it a lot growing up because I couldn't keep my mouth shut about how I didn't think the religion was true, and then that
Mm.
gave them license, so they thought, to threaten me with what I consider to be some of the most limp-wristed threats you can give to somebody.
Yeah, right.
Well, you'll find out after the time
Yeah,
has that
boy,
you can
you
be called
just
on the thing.
wait. You just wait 79.5 years without smoking. Man, you're gonna get it.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
It's the con man's wet dream.
Right.
If you
Yes.
can get somebody to
Yeah.
believe that the consequences for them not believing the con are past the point where they would have an ability to call you on it, if you can get them to swallow that, you can get them to swallow
Yeah.
anything.
Mm.
Yeah.
High school was a little less dramatic on this topic because people were, I guess, growing up and spending more time focusing on things like social events and
Mm.
social interactions that were more secular, not specific to churches,
Mhm.
so
Yes.
sporting
Yeah.
events or dances or dates or
Coming into your independence a bit more.
Mhm.
So, something that I'm hearing a lot in this interview with you is the importance that people around you believing true things, which I think we all, especially in this deconstruction community, that's a big core part of it. We want to be in community with people and be co creating a society where we are believing true things to the point where you felt the need to talk about it. Was it something that you liked to bring up, or was it something that you just knew you just showed up at a place, it would just be a matter of time until someone would start along the topic and then you would kind of join in with your 2 cents? What did that look like for you in your social interactions with people?
few different ways, and I'll start by saying, have either of you seen the movie Don't Look Up? I think that's what it was called. It
Yes.
came a few years ago
Yeah.
during the
Yes.
pandemic.
Yes.
So a lot of my childhood and adolescence and growing up, a lot of it felt a lot like the two main characters in that movie.
Okay.
Just like, I'm pulling my hair out because I can't get you people to
Yeah.
understand
Okay.
that the thing that
Okay.
I'm trying to show you is not true. The fact that you
Yeah.
believe it is a real problem, because if other people thought the way that you did, I would be dead right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like,
Yep.
if the
Yep.
doctors that had saved my life had been more concerned about praying my illness away than trying to go to medical school and learn how reality actually works, I wouldn't survive.
Mhm.
So true.
Mhm. Because I did see that movie, and it's a good portrayal of that sort of isolation that comes with understanding the gravity of a situation and talking with people who can hold a conversation about something, but be in a completely different experience of it. Something that comes to mind from that movie is the two main characters, they're like in some sort of news broadcast, and they're allowed to kind of talk more or less openly about the asteroid or comet or whatever that is headed right to Earth.
Mm.
And they're having this conversation with two people that are like, "Ooh, wow, a comet! Oh, the size of a football field! Oh my God, tell
Mm.
me more!" And they're having a conversation, right? They're talking to each other, but you can tell that the people interviewing them, that the news anchors just are completely oblivious. Like they're in a completely different experience with the idea of the reality, that there is a comet that's coming. It's going to have this kind of impact. And I hear what you're saying. That's what came to mind when you started talking about, oh, I'm pulling my hair out trying to explain this to people. I instantly thought of that news broadcast of the people that just have no concept at all about what it is that they're being told and are just unable to process any shred of weight around what that is.
Yeah.
One of the things as well, like about this topic, and it kind of relates to the movie as well, is from a very young age I've always had a very global and very like foundational viewpoint on things. So like, I remember in grade 2 being concerned that now that we have the ability to put people in space and perhaps even to deflect comets, why we are and asteroids, why we are not as a species spending more of our effort trying to mitigate potential extinction events.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons why we're not is because a huge number of humans are actually in what I would absolutely argue are in death cults.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So like,
Yep.
the reason why in that movie Don't Look Up, the people who were ignoring it were fine to do that is because, I mean, worst case scenario, we're all going to die, and we'll end up, the ones of us who are, who believed like I do, are going to end up in
Mhm.
heaven, and the rest of you can all just go to hell.
Yep.
Mhm.
It's the same kind of thing with climate change. There's no incentive to actually act upon it in our own best
Mhm.
interest, because as far as they're concerned, our best interest is to all die.
Yeah. And it's
Yeah.
not our problem, you know?
Mhm.
As a nerd who's engaged a lot of video games over the years, I've heard the phrase "kill them all and let God figure it out later." I've heard that phrase. How indicative is that of the actual things going on here?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I juxtapose that to what I hear in various indigenous teachings where it's every action is thought about into the seventh generation. So
Mm-hmm.
when you have to engage with the world on this sense of like, I'm borrowing this from our future, sort of presupposing that we're going to be here 7 generations from now, versus something like Christianity, where it is absolutely okay if the planet is going to be blown to smithereens because Jesus can come back in his infinite power and fix it all, wave the magic wand, boom, heaven on earth kind of thing. So there's this sort of carrot stick oasis that keeps people justified in their climate change denial. It keeps them justified in denying science, in denying racism, into when you brought up earlier, saying, ever since we went to space, I wondered why we aren't bracing for mitigating extinction events. And then
Like,
you had said that it was because most of the people are involved in a death cult. And what came to my mind is like, yeah, they are the extinction event, which is why they're
Yeah.
not, it is them. They are the extinction event.
Wow.
And
The believer
just
loves death more than the infidel loves life. I've heard that more than once growing up.
ooh, wow, that runs deep.
Yeah.
That runs really
That
deep.
one's one that I remember Christopher Hitchens saying, but I've heard that a lot, like, even before I remember hearing it from Mr. Hitchens.
So something that comes to my mind when you said that was when that Columbine shooting happened. And I remember being so, that really kind of was a core memory and is a core memory for me. And I remember being in church and listening to a youth pastor tell this made up story about how the shooter supposedly went from person to person asking them if they believed in Jesus, and the kids lied to save their lives. But there was one girl who stood up and took the bullet. And I, dead ass, I kid you not, they literally said, when it comes time for you to stand up for your faith, will you choose the way that this young girl chose? And I remember just thinking in my brain, I don't ever want to have to make that kind of choice. But then also the fear that came with, but if I make the wrong choice and choose my own life, I'm going to go to hell for all eternity. So it's
Right.
like you're constantly having to weigh this horrific, bad, eternal condition that they can't even prove is real. But every time you start to question it, they just, up the ante, like, oh, but like your skin's falling off, and like, oh, and like, and then it grows back and it falls off again. Like they just keep imagining it worse, so that
Yeah.
their imagination for what hell is like is always going to outpace whatever extinction event we're happening in right now. They just make hell 10 times worse. They just say, oh, well, hell's going to be even worse than all of the kids we blew up in the middle strip today. Like
Right.
they're always going to imagine it to be worse than the extinction events that are actually occurring on the planet right now. I find that really interesting when you said, why aren't we doing anything about extinction events? And it's like, well, they're invested in it. They're making money off of it. They're making weapons for it. They're defunding, and they're getting our healthcare to fund, other kinds of extinction events and on other parts of the planet. And I really start to piece together like the fact that people are not just invested in their own, like, oh, I'm going to go to heaven, or my family, my community, my church community, we're going to go to heaven. It's like they're making money off of this.
Yeah, it's like
They're,
Jim Becker
yeah,
and his like prepper kits.
Yeah.
yeah, there is an economy around death, but there's an economy around the fear of death. And I
And
think
that makes
that,
sense
like,
though. Like
mhm,
that totally
mhm,
makes sense. Which is why, like I say, we really do need to keep in mind how much practice, how much trial and error religious institutions and religious people have had in designing things to our deepest and most ingrained fears and insecurities. It's not coincidence that they chose the things that they did to try and to
mhm.
manipulate people into staying into these groups, because it works.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
But I was curious. So, because, your deconstruction journey started so young. And then you mentioned, was it in college that you took religious study courses?
Yeah, I did some in university.
Was that out of necessity or?
I've always been a fan of historical fiction as an art form, you know?
Yeah.
I learned things from Star Trek just like I can learn things from other stories, so I might as well
Yeah.
immerse myself in them at least a little bit.
Fair enough.
Mhm.
No, actually, because that is one of the, I keep mentioning it, but that's because where I'm at right now with the whole Christ before Jesus book of it all is whether or not it's the whole religion is true at this point isn't even what is so fascinating to me, as now it's like, how did we get from 100 CE all the way to where we are now? Like, what it has been the process of the way that this religion started. And if anything, I think that in itself is interesting, not necessarily the doctrine of it all, but I have even likened it to a college course. It feels like I'm taking a college course in the beginnings of Christianity, and it's so fascinating. I mean, going back to 200 CE when, this person had documents from this time and decided to take out these bits and then pass this on, and then this person added on to it. It is interesting. It really is.
thousands and thousands of years of refined marketing.
Mm-hmm.
If anything at all we can take away from Christianity specifically is that Paul was a heck of a marketer for the time.
Yeah, but that's even assuming Paul was a real person. And that's what I find so fascinating about the book, is it even gets into like that element of what they have posited in the book is true. Then that it's also fascinating too about how this character was created by, hundreds of years of writers working together, even if not directly hand in hand, to create this character, to create this religion off of, really.
Yeah, if Paul was a real person, if he was, I don't know. But if Paul was a real person, Paul was a master, a marketer. He made Christianity marketable to billions and billions and billions of Gentiles over the years, it turns out. If it wasn't true, then the authors who invented the character of Paul wrote a character who was an exceptionally good marketer.
Exactly. It's so fascinating.
And then secured a financial base. So not only have you expanded your client base, but then you've also like attached this sort of economic principle to it. And then you're like, okay, now you go and make disciples of everybody else. And so it really is like the first pyramid scheme.
Literally.
Don't forget that they also put in the fear of loss, which is an important sales tactic as well. So that's what I'm saying. Like, if Paul existed, he was a master marketer for the time. If he didn't exist, then the people who invented that character were master marketers. And that's what religions had a lot of time to do, is to practice and refine its ability to market.
And now we've got the Pascal's wager. Like, oh, well, it'll cost you nothing except 10% every time of your paycheck, right?
Nothing, except for your own integrity for your entire life, perhaps.
And your humanity.
Yeah.
For the low price of your humanity.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, it definitely is, at a minimum, I think, super fascinating as a whole. Like I said, whether or not it's true or not, just from like the whole historical fiction standpoint of it, I think it's really fascinating to see how something like what it is now can start, and like what it takes. And it really just takes some smart people and lies basically to create what we have today. In the way of Christianity, because it is so insidious, like having done a lot of like the learning that I've done, like I said, through Christ before Jesus, is like it literally is based on lies. People lying about certain things and claiming people existed who didn't, and saying that they have writings from people who didn't ever actually write to them. I mean, in this case of Christianity, it is insidious. Like, one of the most famous church fathers of the religion is quoted in writings as saying, I purposely left out all of the bad things from all of the documents that we have, and only am putting forward all of the good things. So that's what I mean. Like, it's taken people, because even way back then, a lot of the lies that were perpetrated were done by people who had the advantage of being able to write when other people couldn't, or like read when other people couldn't, or translate a language that other people weren't familiar with. And so many people over time had their hands on this religion that were able to craft it into what it is today. And going all the way back to like the Judaism beginnings, it may have been a lot more innocent, but at some point, a group of people with Christianity made it a conscious decision to create what they created. I mean, that's just kind of what it comes down to.
I think
there's definitely a political aspect of it. That's a fair thing to say. Absolutely.
Political, and also too the way this religion and the doctrines that come out of this theology, the way that has evolved across Turtle Island is a specific flavor of nefarious, because we see things like boarding schools, things like plantation human trafficking, this sort of thing. And it really does go back to the point that you made, Asheron, earlier about it supports my God. But also at the same time, there are layers to that where it is our God that can be enforced by institutions that are putting money into weaponry to force people over and to genocide people and, all of these sorts of things. So, yeah, I do understand the sentiments about the doctrine itself being built on lies because we see today the culmination of that, like how that historical trajectory has landed us today, where we have people that are in the highest echelons of the United States government that are actively deleting historical records
Yeah.
about enslaved people. They are taking out from the Library of Congress. They're erasing things about George Washington. So we grew up in school being taught that George Washington had fake teeth and that they were wooden teeth, that it was a certain tree that they cut down and those were like the first kind of dentures. But he pulled those teeth from a trafficked African man, pulled all of his teeth, like not like line them up and you get the molar, you get the front. No, and that would already be bad enough.
Mm-hmm.
He pulled all of somebody's teeth to eat with. And
Wow.
they took that out of the Library of Congress. Even if the people who composed the originating documents were not necessarily thinking about, like, oh, how do we like destroy the planet? Like,
Mhm.
even if that wasn't necessarily the seed point, the fact that it could be taken to this such extreme, it is an issue. And for me, it does point to the urgency on why it is important to believe true things. Even if we wanted to take the document as having some sort of, we don't take the contents of it to be serious and we don't have to internalize the contents, but we can respect the document itself as a historical thing. Like humans
Mm-hmm.
wrote this some thousand years ago and blah, 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 blah. And also that starting point and where it touches down in this body, in this lifetime, across Turtle Island or across different parts of Asia or across Indonesia or wherever it is that it landed, we see the different ways that when it does touch it down, what kind of storyline it develops. And we see it developing the same kinds of storylines, particularly enslavement and the genocide of tribal identities. That's a
Mm-hmm.
common theme everywhere this religion is brought to, whether it's brought by Spanish or English or French or Italian, whether it's brought by the Holy Roman Catholic Church, whoever it's brought by,
Mm-hmm.
they're doing the same kinds of thing. I don't know. For me, there are different flavors of Christianity, but when it comes to those heavier storylines of just the suffering that is caused under this religion, they are very much the same kinds of things in different places and different times. I do find it interesting to talk about, or at least to consider and to think about this sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
There's a saying I remember hearing growing up, and it went something like this. He said, "If fundamentalists you find are always assholes, then maybe you've got really shitty fundamentals."
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think for a religion like Christianity and others as well, but Christianity is the one that we're all three of us, I'm sure, most familiar with,
Mhm.
given where we're from.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Fundamentally, the message of Christianity is the message of North Korea, and that is there is nothing greater than the highest tyrant, which is God.
Mm-hmm.
Correct.
But also,
Yeah.
God is me because shut up, I'm right.
Right.
Yeah.
Baked into the DNA of this religion is the
Mm-hmm.
maximal possible tyrant. You're wrong to even suspect that the maximal possible tyrant is even a bad thing, because how could the most tyrant be a bad thing if the tyrant's told you it's good?
Yeah.
Right.
Like, there's no wonder that Christianity brings slavery wherever it goes. In the Bible, it says, you are all slaves to God.
Right.
And you're supposed to be joyful of your slavery.
Yeah. And thankful for it. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so true.
Baked into its entire DNA is oppression and tyranny.
Mm-hmm.
There can be no greater tyrant than the God of the Bible.
So true.
Mm-hmm.
Gets back to what I was saying when we first opened this up about Abraham and Isaac. You have to convince people that hatred is love, so that when you present them the hatred, they will love it.
Mm. Yeah, that's so true. And that's actually a great way to segue, because I did want to get into the from a young age, like you said, you were kind of engaged in the counter apologetics. So at what point did that transition to your experience with the deconstruction community and like the conversations you have, you know, through that? I think you've said before, like you do actually engage Christians in conversation and whatnot. Like, how did all of that start?
That was mostly enabled by the internet.
Right.
Yeah, because basically any atheist anywhere knows that you are taking a risk to your safety in even engaging in these topics, even in secular democracies.
Mm-hmm.
So the ability to be able to have at least some degree of separation and anonymity is a real liberating factor in your ability to have these conversations that are so designed to be emotionally charged that you can't help
Yeah.
but have people lash out in violence against you when you challenge them.
Mm-hmm. But how did you find yourself, like, for example, in the Deconstruction Junction? Like, what was your start there?
I don't even remember exactly how I had first heard about Deconstruction Zone or Deconstruction Junction or anything like that. I'd been following on YouTube a bit some of the old atheist experience content, mostly because I found it entertaining more so than like educational, because a lot of the things that, like I said, there's very few actual arguments for God. A lot of it, what I learned about it was different analogies or different ways to communicate a specific idea rather than learning new ideas or learning new arguments or how to navigate certain arguments. I already knew them, but I guess through spending so many times having clips of that pass through my YouTube while I was doing other things, it started passing through Deconstruction Zone, and then I just decided that, you know, I had recently parted ways with another community online that I'd spent a number of years with due to a friend of mine had died very suddenly. So I was looking for a bit of a new home. One of the things that I've always kind of struggled with in my own life is trying to find things that I could get really passionate about to be able to turn into something that I could really throw myself into.
Yeah.
And so in my difficulty at doing that, I've kind of adopted a simple phrase, and that is, if you're having difficulty finding meaning in your own life, try and make other people's lives meaningful.
Oh.
And one of the ways that I feel like I can contribute to maybe doing that is to teach people that the truth matters more than anything, and that religions are by their very nature poisonous. So like I'm one of, like, you might hear a lot of atheists say like, I don't care what you believe so long as you're not trying to push it on other people. I'm not one of those people.
Yeah, same.
Yeah.
I do care what you think, and I, even more than that, I care why you think these things, because if you have a fundamentally broken process on something like religion that is supposedly quite important, then
Yep.
I can only imagine how bad your process is on something important like how should we handle things like healthcare.
Correct.
Mm.
Yes.
On
Correct.
things like medical research. Just think about this. In the year 2000 is when we were sequencing the human genome, and we were also like, there was a real major push to fund stem cell research. And there was a whole lot of enthusiasm in the scientific community. This might be the next big field of scientific and medical breakthrough that could completely destroy certain illness or eradicate certain diseases, or with the
Yeah.
potential of which we will never know, because a whole bunch of conservative religious people in the United States decided that doing stem cell research was bad because they didn't know how it worked. They just knew it was related somehow to babies.
I remember that, but being inside where they were telling us, approaching the year 2000, around that time, they were telling us that the only way they could get stem cells, can't get it from an adult. No, 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 no. The only way you can get stem cells is from dead infants, fetuses.
Oh.
And that's what they were telling us from the pulpit, that that was the only way. Get out there, vote, 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 protest, demonstrate, do everything you can, stand up for the unborn. Like, because they were telling us that the only way that they could get stem cells was from aborted babies, especially like brownie point
Wow.
if they were in the 9th month. I remember it was either in my church or like a church function that I went to, because we network with other churches in the areas. I feel like it's something I heard in our church network, and then it was just kind of echoed at home, but they really drilled home that point that it was aborted babies is where they were getting the stem cells, and they were coming up
Man.
with all kinds of money to pay women to go get pregnant just to have an abortion so they could sell the stem cells.
Oh
Like, it was the
my.
stem cell, yeah, that was a
Well,
whole thing.
and it's also a lie, which kind of also circles back to another thing I was saying, is that so much of this is all just a smokescreen for "no, I'm right, shut up." They couldn't even be bothered to learn the information that was available at the time on exactly how scientists did
Mhm.
and were planning to harvest stem cells that did not
Mhm.
involve aborting babies, like impregnated
Yeah.
specifically to be aborted. No,
Specifically, yes.
you
Yep.
can't even like represent the position that you're hating on correctly
Accurately.
Correct.
because
Yes.
that
Yeah.
you know that you don't actually have a thing to stand on, because your only
Mm-hmm.
point is not "I'm right because shut up."
Yes.
We will never know how many billions of lives may have been drastically improved or saved because of somebody's completely screwed up ability to either not care about the truth at all, or to have
Yep.
no concept in how to actually get to the truth and determine what it is.
Mhm.
I have never and will never be the type of person to be like, let the religious people do what they want so long as they're keeping it to themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Even if, quote unquote, all they're doing is passing it on to their kids, it's still not responsible for us to let that go unchecked in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to present that a third option. They either have no idea what the opposing position is, like they cannot properly, well, hold on, let me stop broad stroking here. But from what I see, most Christians that I listen to have a very difficult time properly representing anything that is opposed to their worldview. They don't always understand the arguments and the claims of the opposing side, if that makes sense.
Yes, if they
Yes.
did, they would have to actually grapple with the fact that "no, I'm right because shut up" is actually inconsistent with reality a lot of the time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Whether they don't know the facts because they don't want to, or they just have partial information, or they kind of read one thing and then let the Holy Spirit run away with them, to some sort of made up thing, or whether they have a personal stake in getting as many people as possible to sign this thing.
Yeah.
And I think that's also a part of it too, because with the movement of Christianity, there's always money behind it. And that's not unique because we're humans and we've always been trading resources, or bartering with one another. But I remember someone had posted this like VHS clip from like the late 90s. I don't know what it was about hitting 2000, man, but Christians, like, we were like headed for glory. And
People were caught up in Y2K, and there's going to be a global apocalypse because all of our technology is going to fail because any 5 minutes now for the rest of eternity.
yeah, but it was the countdown to when everything reset to zero because
Yeah.
computers don't know any number after 1999. No number exists. It's done. We're going to go back to zero, y'all. I remember like one of the things that I talked about in my episode was how I was never taught in those religious spaces how to properly investigate counter arguments. I was never taught how to vet texts, how to vet the things that I'm hearing, how to locate experts, and how to approach things with a curiosity that allows me to one, illuminate my biases, illuminate the things that I just automatically believe, and then two, change those beliefs upon receiving new information. I wasn't taught how to do any of those kinds of things. So whatever someone was saying from the pulpit, it was just sort of taken unquestioning, and then I would go and find everything to make that what I heard correct.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to, this issue of like the stem cell thing, climate change was another thing. I remember listening to someone saying how the excess CO2 in the air is actually good because that's what plants breathe in. So it's like a mulch. And the
Oh
guy was saying,
my.
yeah, like a vapor mulch. The guy was, he would say things like, I was talking to my scientist buddy the other day, and he was telling me like the CO2, like the plants are breathing it in and that's what's helping them grow. But just the way that he would just like pull something out of his ass, so
Ugh.
clearly pull it out of his ass, the way that they just don't know how to interact with experts.
Yeah.
And so I want to get back to that point, Ashiran, that you were making about them not understanding all of the pieces that are on the table and the ones that do know what's at stake but are moving through Christianity anyways. I feel like for me personally, those are the ones that I have my eyes on. So I hear what you're saying about like, no, I can't just let you, quote unquote, let you believe this thing without investigating why. Is it a personal integrity thing? Is it you're scared of going to hell? You know, what is it on a personal individual level? Or is there some sort of personal stake that you have in what are your investment points in keeping these harmful cycles going? Because when I listen to preachers like prosperity preachers, I don't want to say names in case this ever gets famous and then we get hit with like a cease and desist. Mole Osteen, you guys know who I'm talking about. Like prosperity, mega churches, da da da. I don't look at that preacher in the same way that I look at the people on the other side of the pulpit. And, at some level, I start to think, at what level are you consciously aware of what you're doing? And you're doing it because it works. It gets you to proximity to power. It gets you proximity to resources. It gets you proximity to whatever it is that you're in proximity to. And that's why you're continuing to go on, not necessarily for the sake of the doctrine itself. And so when it comes to like this whole stem cell thing and even like the climate change with the CO2 being the mulch, according to my scientist buddy, and they never have names. They never
Right.
have names. No, we just know that he's a scientist.
Trust me,
But yeah,
bro.
yeah, trust me, bro. Yes. What is it like coming into an atheist space of adult people that are really renegotiating some really profound existential things that you kind of already reconciled at a young age? What's that like for you?
I'm not gonna lie, I still to this day find it a little strange. Like I'm not sure
I wanted
how
to ask,
how to
are we
relate.
weird? Are we weird? You
I
can tell
mean,
us.
everybody's weird. I'm a weirdo.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I do find it kind of weird just to interact with because my situation has been so different from everybody else's.
Sure.
Like
Mhm.
I try not to undersell or take for granted the fact that I didn't have parents who were actively trying to indoctrinate me into something. So I don't know
Yeah.
what the effect of that is like on somebody who
Yeah.
grew up in a situation like that. I can only imagine for myself.
Mhm.
I struggle even to this day to try and keep that in mind, but I find it hard to relate to just because it's so different. Like, I'm grateful that the deconstruction community exists, and it's absolutely right, given the time that we live in, that it is made up of people who perhaps grew up in it and then have later either are finding their way out or have found their way out.
Yeah.
That is
Yeah.
100% appropriate and where the community ought to be focused,
Mhm.
especially where we're at now. I am an outlier. I am not the person who needs help in that kinds of thing and support in being like in feeling safe in
Mhm.
pulling these things apart because I've never felt safe about it. I just had to do it because I couldn't bullshit myself.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I try to practice like patience and empathy and compassion with regards to these things, but
We talk about the nervous system and then we talk about the neurological patterning that expresses itself in the way of like their kind of closed loop logic, the kind of argumentative fallacies that they always fall into, this sort of thing. But in a very physiological sense, you didn't internalize the imprint. So even as you are trying to hold space for that empathy, for that compassion, there are inherently going to be limits to that because your biology wasn't wired to receive those kinds of imprints. Whereas those of us who did grow up with that fear, internalizing the collective fear around failure in this religion and having bought into the existential weight of the heaven hell kind of binary debacle thing. When you aren't imprinted with that, there are just going to be natural limits to what you can understand and how you can relate. And to that end, I would say that that is okay.
Yeah.
But I also do want to say, I do think there is a role in talking about the kind of experiences that you have with this, because I really feel like a lot of many younger people will come across this even decades into the future and will be able to relate more to you and your experiences than to even some of the other people, and including ourselves, that are deconstructing away.
So
And
true.
so, yeah, that was why I really, really wanted to have you in here for those people and can sort of find some sort of representation in, like, oh, hey, someone else that that
Yeah.
also has no idea what it feels like to be afraid of this sort of thing. But I will also say too, there are very nuanced experiences, especially across Turtle Island. The reasons why Black and Native people have had to cleave to this religion versus the reason why settlers have had to, people of European descent, have had to cleave to this religion are very, very different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it just in terms of not just the trauma that gets inflicted in a singular lifetime, this fear of hell that sinks into the nervous system, and then you just start to scramble. You're in survival mode, the fight or flight mode, all of these sorts of things. But the intergenerational trauma that's passed from one generation to the next out of plantation trafficking experiences, out of boarding school and trafficking experiences. It's a very different kind of collective imprint that dealing with the doctrine in and of itself isn't going to necessarily address the root causes of it.
That's
Like, it
true.
is a root of it, the way that the doctrine was used was a root of it, but deconstruction Christianity versus deconstructing, and it's all enmeshed together, so I'm not putting these in nice little neat boxes. I'm just saying that the threads that weave Christianity together for settler communities are not the threads that have woven Christianity together with these levels of intense violence over time, the sexual violence as well, enslavement, all of this sort of thing. There are layers of physical trauma inflicted on very specific groups of people through the religion justified by the doctrine. And I firmly believe that just addressing the doctrine in and of itself isn't going to necessarily cut to the core of addressing those like plantation intergenerational traumas and boarding school intergenerational
Mm-hmm.
traumas. So there are a lot of reasons why different groups are sort of stuck in this. If we don't hold on to this, we are going to die. Extinction
Yeah.
level events, because they survived extinction level events by holding on to it. And
Mm-hmm.
even if it's not something that's on the forefront of the consciousness anymore, because the times have changed and it's racism has evolved, it's shifted, but the programming of the mind is still very much running those survival coping mechanisms for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd say that's probably absolutely true. We are the descendants of survivors, so as long as we
Yeah.
are alive, we're going to have to wrestle with that aspect of our psyche.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I personally can't speak to things like intergenerational trauma or being, the descendant of, conquered and genocidal
Mm-hmm.
peoples because my dad's an Englishman. My mom is a Melanemic Canadian.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, I don't know what intergenerational trauma is like, really. Like, I can intellectualize it to a point, but
Sure.
That speaks to the importance of our community and of having so
Mm-hmm.
many different
Yeah.
experiences is because there is then the different elements that people can speak to, and that comes into play. And we've talked about it before, the approach that Asheron, may take to talking to a Christian may be effective for some Christians. The tactic that like your thinker would take is going to work for some people. And that's why there's
Mm-hmm.
so many
Yeah.
different content creators across the board, because they all have their own experiences and their own thought processes that come into play that are effective for some and not effective for others. And so I think that it is important that we have the different approaches to deconstruction. It even comes, full circle back to the reason that we have this podcast. Like you said, if all goes well, generations down the road, somebody looking back on any of of this content may relate more to Asheron's story than anyone else's because that's more
Yeah.
reflective of their experience. And that's why the whole goal in creating this podcast was to capture all the different stages of deconstruction, the different kinds of deconstruction stories, like what that looks like, so that there is something for everyone to relate to, because it is so nuanced and different for everyone. And so I am really glad that we had this conversation because, yeah, absolutely, it's a perspective that is worth sharing, but also should be, you know, received, should be heard, I guess, is kind of the way that I was trying to think of it.
As the internet has expanded, religions are slowly dying. That means that a story like mine may likely become more common, and that we should take that as the victory that it is. Because if more people end up growing up and having an experience around religion more like mine, that just means that it's another person that the religion wasn't able to get their hooks into young.
Yes.
And
Exactly.
every single time that happens, that gives them a better chance to not succumb to it in the future.
Yep.
Yeah.
100%. Do you feel like we kind of are brought to where you are today in terms of your like journey, so to speak? Or do you feel like there's still any parts that are kind of missing? Or
So one thing that I would mention that I don't suppose really touched on, coming into spaces like the deconstruction community, when I tend to tell people about my situation and how I never believed it, the impression that I get back from a lot of people is that they think that I'm better than them, or that I'm smarter than them, or that, you know, I look down upon them. And I'm never quite sure if that's just me being paranoid about it or if it's actually the case.
Well, so for me, I had a moment of immediately I observed myself having that feeling of jealousy. And especially because I don't think that you necessarily give off an air of superiority. I think that there is a baseline confidence that many of us were not allowed to access at the most critical stages of our human development. And I think that does play a role into it. But I do, for me, within myself, recognize that, okay, I observed myself having this feeling of jealousy. Now let's sort of think about what are the archetypes here. Again, because your story is when you are 5 years old, that age is such a delicate and precious age that really is that inner child. And I think that for a lot of us who are trying to reclaim that, who are trying to be the adults now that should have been there for us when we were kids, that should have protected us from the bullshit, that should have set up and said, no, actually, we're not going to come back here again, right? That should have turned over the tables, but didn't or couldn't because they are stuck in, drinking the Kool-Aid. So I think there's an element there when you're able to touch on a moment in time that can't really ever be changed. Although we can change our relationship to those experiences, we can change our perceptions of that experience. The fact of the matter is that the way that that storyline played out, it just is the way that it played out for all of the reasons that we've hashed over, over the course of the thing. So it's a hard thing trying to navigate a shattered foundation, trying to be an adult when especially if we don't have a blueprint on what a functional adult really is supposed to look like with healthy boundaries, with healthy relationships from one generation to the next generation.
yeah.
But then also, I do see a lot of, I do recognize a lot of grief with some members of our community on the time lost. I can't believe I spent
Yeah.
so much time. I can't believe I wasted the best years of my life. And, when I was young and had vitality and I was jumping for Jesus instead of doing what I really wanted to do. Right. So there's a sort of lamenting over time lost and thinking back, like, if I had known even if not, if I had if it had clicked in my head at 5 years old, how different would my life be now?
Yeah.
And so there is that kind of delicate thing to navigate because you're striking right to the inner child. and you're presenting an inner child that a lot of us, for whatever the reasons are, justified or not, making sense or not, the fact still remains is that we didn't have access to that, and we have to recreate that and rebuild that, and then still be adults, and then still navigate not really having role models and not having mentors and not having, people that we're looking forward to connecting with until now that we're meeting in community. So yeah, I just wanted to put that out there just as my own kind of thoughts and observation of myself during this podcast recording.
Yeah, it may not necessarily be something that you're doing per se, but it's just the reaction to, something that is for a lot of us still very real, that we're still in the thick of reconciling. And I think that, just by living the life that you lived, unknowingly touching on some insecurities or trauma that other people have, and there's not a whole lot that you can do about that.
Hopefully this podcast will be a way for people to view this differently, which is why I wanted to assert this looking forward to the future. What is it like to raise kids who are not, because many of us in the community are raising kids. Right. I really wanted to also strike that chord, as well as also reiterate what I had said in the beginning. Being sucked into a cult, it really is not about how smart or quote unquote not smart somebody is. We see smart people get sucked into this. There are deeper things that are occurring in the psyche, in the nervous system, in the survival mechanisms of the body itself. This religion is able to really tap in and hijack those wirings and reprogram it to make you a cog in their great machine. I don't want to use ableist terms, but I know that I've dealt with ableism folding in on my own self with the negative self-talk that I had about myself, just not believing, like, how could I be this dense for so long? Like, how could I, all of the lamenting and this sort of thing. So that's also why I wanted to say, like, this is something that we can look forward to. And we really are getting a singular snapshot of what future generations can build off of, what kind of experiences that they can build off of, not having this sort of program hijacking their physiology at such young ages.
Yeah.
It can be easy to default back to that self-depreciation.
I remember when I first saw, it was a clip of the Oprah Winfrey show, and it had Dan Barker on it, and Oprah was saying, so like, you spent 20 something years as a preacher, and now you're saying that you're not anymore, so what does that say about you? Because she was expecting him to say, well, it means I was a fucking idiot. And what he said was, well, what it means is that I made a mistake. I was wrong about this particular claim. And you know what? Sometimes humans are wrong, and how we grow is finding out when we're wrong. So finding out that you were wrong about something isn't a mark against your ability. It's an opportunity for you to refine your truth model.
I like that. That is super true.
The other thing I'd like to point out, just to go back to our previous point, is the idea that how did I waste so much time being indoctrinated into this thing? Like the lamentation, to me, because I don't have that particular lamentation, I take cues from another thing in my life. I'm a permanently disabled person and will likely always be, and I have been since I was an infant. I could spend a lot of time saying like, oh, what would my life have been had my vision been less crappy? The thing is, and I take it from an episode of Star Trek, actually, about a blind man in Star Trek, and he said, do you hate your glasses, for lack of a better word, or do you hate your vision? Like, what do you mean? Like, these are things about me, and I like who I am. They make up part of who I am, so it would be weird for me to hate these things about myself. Like, if you like yourself at all, the things in your life that led you to the point that you are right now are part of what made you the person you like in yourself.
Yeah.
If you don't hate yourself, then everything about your life that led up to you is the thing that made you into the person you don't hate.
Yeah, and I think that is a really great note to kind of close things out on because, Garnet, you hit on we're speaking to the future and what that could look like. And Asheron, learning what we believed in all this time is bullshit, isn't a mark against us, but it's a good thing. Now we know, and now we get to decide how we move going forward, how we navigate our familial ties. I think those are two really good sentiments to kind of carry through to the next part where we have questions for our guests that are geared towards like, how did you rebuild your personal foundation? But in this case, you're a little bit different in that you were able to build your own foundation way back then. So I think as far as the questions, what I really think is important to touch on in this case is more of like the community element, because we are talking about what this community and this movement means for the future. And this is kind of what we have now. This is where we're making our mark and where we're making a difference. And so the first question that I want to ask is, when it's all said and done, what is it that you would like to contribute to this community?
I would like to contribute an unyielding desire for the truth and an acceptance of nothing less.
I like that.
Like, in the end, if you do not hold the truth in value above all other things, then all other things can be used to turn the truth into whatever you want it to be.
Yeah, I like that, taking the truth back.
The truth is the only thing that matters, because without the truth, you have nothing.
What do you hope to receive from this community?
I don't know. I just want to feel like I'm useful. I can contribute. Like I said, I've been engaged in counter-apologetics since I was 5 years old. I have something to offer on this topic that can help keep people away from dangerous religions that aren't true.
Yeah. I feel like I would like to see you being somebody who has these conversations with people, because I like the way that you approach things.
Because of the nature of my disabilities, it's kind of hard for me to do these kinds of things on my own, or for me to like solo a stream or something like that.
Sure.
I could not. I am physiologically incapable of being able to read a chat while I'm doing anything else. I just can't.
Right.
Do it.
Yeah.
So like, put me on a live with somebody else, I can be the
co-host.
Yeah, that's I mean, that's a good point. Our community is all about collaboration, so
And ask my wife, I am a total team player.
Yeah.
I am good at supporting a team. That's what I am. I'm a team first kind of person.
Aw. So maybe that's what we work on, is finding somebody that you can collaborate with, because I don't know how we could ever have enough people out fighting the fight. You know what I mean? Like, it's important, the community aspect, that we're all there for each other. It's also important, the conversations that we have with people in the chat. It's also so important that we have people on the front lines having these conversations and exposing people to the information that they may not have gotten otherwise. And, like, sure, you can catch a lot of people with a big net, but there's also fish that avoid the big net and, might be more apt to be caught with your pole or your net. I just don't think that we could ever have too many people fighting the good fight.
Some people are going to be convinced by Richard Dawkins' eloquence. Some will be convinced by Christopher Hitchens' wit. Other people are going to be convinced by Matt Dillahunty beating him into the ground with a logic shovel.
Exactly. Exactly. So that's
Some
why.
people are going to be convinced by me, maybe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. Okay, well, that is our show. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. This was a really cool conversation. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah.
It's been my pleasure.
For those of you still listening, please make sure you like, subscribe, and share your thoughts on today's episode with us below.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.